Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we discuss research-backed strategies and techniques with recognized thought leaders that will deliver results that matter and create lasting change for leaders at all levels. Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Haydn Shaw, who has researched and helped clients regarding generational differences for over 20 years. He is the author of the best-selling book, Sticking Points: How to Get 4 Generations Working Together in the 12 Places That They Come Apart. And it's a best-selling book. He has spoken to over 100,000 people and worked with more than 1,500 businesses, from Fortune 500 companies to startups, not-for-profits, and government agencies. He speaks and consults about generations, leadership, management, and trust. And the results from his long-term organizational development and change projects have been written up in various case studies. Thank you for joining me on the program today, Haydn.
Thanks for having me. It's a fun topic.
It is. Looking forward to getting into it. But before we do, I'd love to get some background on you and really what got you interested in this topic and writing this book.
A couple of things. The first one is I had a traditionalist father who was not opposed to making comments about rock music being the destruction of the teenage mind. And I was just listening to kind of the equivalent of Light FM. He had no idea what Led Zeppelin could do to the teenage mind. And so, there was already in the home I grew up in some generational differences. And I found the first 2 or 3 bosses that I worked with to be similar, cut out of a similar cloth as my father was. And so that got me interested. And when I was working in nonprofit organizations, there was a big drop off from the level of engagement of the World War II generation that did pretty much everything in groups. A lot of associations, a lot of groups that they created, whereas baby boomers were much more independent and less interested in that. And so nonprofits really faced a major shift. So you had to understand the next generation back in the day if you were going to be able to lead well.
Well, and you explained, too, that never has so many generations been in existence at once. And a lot of people are really not sure how to deal with that. And what I love about your research in your book is that you don't simply explain these differences, which many people have done in the past. You show us how to use a 5-step process to work through and transcend through common sticking points between generations.
It's interesting. When I wrote the book, the publisher said, "Wow, your chapters are really repetitive. I think you're going to need to rewrite them." And I said, "I know you guys don't do a huge number of business books, but most people don't read a business book. They read the chapters that they need. And so I want to make this absolutely easy for a person to go, all right, here are the steps and here's what you need to do." So, so many books I've read, you have to kind of figure it out when it's all done. You got to put it all together. I wanted to kind of walk a person through a recipe of what to do. And so I'm surprised how many people read it front to back, because I don't often read books that way. And, most people don't. But that was the goal of it, to make it absolutely practical without leaving a lot of pieces out so the person could know what to do.
Well, that's great. And just, it's really unique to have all these generations coming together in the workplace. And you have some great tools to help in dealing with these intergenerational issues. And I like the analogy that you said that these generations might as well be from different countries, right? Because their cultural styles and preferences are so different. And we need to focus on the why, not the what.
Well, you bet, because the what gets us really frustrated. For example, I was just talking last week to a person that runs a concrete business. And he said, our rule has been you cannot have a cell phone in the vehicle. So, you put it away in a locker and it begins, you don't have it with you. They said, what we can't do is hire people under 30 with that rule. Now, we do it for safety so that nobody's tempted. He said, but even people that come to us and are really excited about having a career here say, I can't what? He said, so we're literally rethinking that. So asking why is that such a big deal is a different kind of question than what is wrong with this generation that they're obsessed with their phone. And that allowed them to rethink a policy instead of saying, well, we're not giving in on that. That's silly on their part. The minute we start thinking, well, that's silly, we've run into a generational sticking point, because the generational sticking point is anytime people from different countries, different generational eras answer the same question very differently and then stare back at each other because the answer is obvious to them. Should I be able to have my phone in the truck if I don't look at it while I'm driving? No, of course. And so, boom, we end up with the sticking point. And whys bridge those. What's divide? Whys unite? What's divide? And so, if I can paraphrase a beer commercial, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious. Ask why, and you'll get a whole lot better results than asking what. What's different or what's wrong.
I love that framework, and knowing those 12 sticking points, you're right, allows teams to label these tension points and work through them, maybe even anticipate them. And we're going to go through some of those sticking points. We're not going to have time for all 12, but they really can empower you if you kind of work through those through this framework, I think, to really build greater bridges and less divides between various generations. Now, in this 5 generation new reality, and we're going to talk about some of those generations here in a minute, you have some ways in which generations can impact your organization. And 3 of the big ones that you mentioned in your book and in your research is really conflicts around generational sticking points, which we kind of alluded to, and we'll get to the top 3, but also the critical nature of trying to manage and motivate different generations is such a critical issue these days, because with millennials, Gen Zs, with Xers and baby boomers, which are the predominant ones now in the generation, they're motivated right in different ways. And you can't just assume that that same structure or path that you use with a Gen Xer is going to work with a millennial or a Gen Z.
That's right. It was interesting when kind of an adopted daughter of ours called me and said, "Do you have any resources that'll help me with Gen Z?" So she's a younger millennial who had at a young age kind of taken over a nonprofit organization. And she said, "I just don't understand what to do with Gen Z." And so it doesn't take long, even for the second half, the younger half of a generation, to then be a bit puzzled by why another generation reacts differently or responds differently to something that just makes sense to them. That's different than how they would have handled it, even at the same age.
Well, and the other big issue for a lot of organizations is trying to replace baby boomers in the war for talent. And that is for succession planning purposes, that's really critical. I'm sure you've seen that through your work as well.
Well, you bet. There's really 2 aspects to that: the succession planning that you've mentioned. And it's one of those things that organizations really only pay attention to. The research is pretty clear on this. They talk about it, but they only pay attention to it when they've had a surge of turnover, of people leaving and taking a lot of intellectual capital, a lot of know-how with them. And then that ties to that sticking point of knowledge transfer. How do we get knowledge transfer to happen before it walks out the door? And the research is pretty clear on this. It takes about, anybody can learn a job in about a year. Tacit knowledge, or that's a buzzword for the stuff when you know an account well enough that you know how they're going to think. You can anticipate what's going to happen. When you know how to work your way through a particular situation quickly, because you know how the internal mechanism of your organization works. That tacit knowledge is about 7 years in the making, which is a bit of a challenge because Bureau of Labor Statistics marks long-term employees at 3 years. And so our federal government does that, and it takes a long time for tacit knowledge. So you can see why organizations are worried about the succession planning, and especially in their leadership spots, but also in what's walking out the door.
Absolutely. And the bottom line is clear. Younger generations are going to bring change, and smart organizations are not going to try to fight what they can't stop. You've identified 4 approaches that you can take in dealing with generations, and love to just give a high level summary if you could of those. I'll kind of give you those and then maybe just talk about each one. Is one, you can ignore them, which I think is the natural inclination for some of us, just to say, well, they're not a big enough sector yet, so let's just pretend they don't exist. 2, you could fix them, which once again, probably not the best alternative, even though it's very tempting to try to fix them. 3, when you know that they're coming in larger quantities and you can't ignore them or fix them, you may need to cut a deal with them. But the ideal scenario is to try to find a way to lead them.
Those 4 are pretty tempting, aren't they? Yeah, it's fun. I like to ask organizations. So, if I'm doing a large speech, I'll actually stop right there frequently and say, okay, talk to the people around you. What's your organization do? Now, you probably do more than one, but what do you do? And it's really across the board that you find, even in the same organization, trying different approaches to it. You can see it in dress code, for example, where there are particular dress codes on particular days. And we're definitely seeing it in remote and hybrid, where organizations are cutting a deal. Okay, on Monday through Wednesday. Wait, no, Thursday through. And so organizations are now trying to figure out, how do we cut a deal to make everybody happy? But yeah, fixing is a tough one, because not only are older generations trying to fix younger generations, but younger generations roll their eyes and work really hard to fix the older generations in their work, or even more so in their personal life. And so it really does go both ways. But leadership is an approach that transcends all of those, because leadership is the only one that allows us to truly appreciate rather than try to change or fix something else. Leadership allows us to appreciate those differences. And then that leads us right into the 5-step process for leading through those generational differences.
And I love what you say with leaders, and I'm taking this right out of your book, is that leaders love their people. I mean, all great leaders do. If we love people, we don't try to change them. We can only lead people if we quit trying to change them, and if we quit trying to change them until we appreciate them. And we can't appreciate them until we understand them. So leadership needs to start with understanding.
If we get some insight and understand how different generations and people of different life stages, because life stage is the cutting edge of generational research. If we understand how generations and life stage will impact things, then we can begin to appreciate that their responses are rational and often thoughtful, even though they're different than what we would do. We just get curious. We get curious about it. I remember when a president of a company said to me, I felt like I was not generational until I heard you. And then I realized I fit exactly in the baby boomers, right down to the shoes I wear. I said, yeah, you really do. He said, but I didn't think I did, because I've got kids across 2 generations. So I thought, I'm above this. He said, then I started feeling really badly. That's the next thing I felt. He said, then I realized they're a different country than I am. I don't have to know their country. I just have to be willing to understand it and not be a jerk about it when I'm there in their country. And I thought that was a great way to say it. You don't have to be from here. You just can't be a jerk.
Absolutely. And I think that 5-step process is really the process that all leaders should go through in trying to accept more of these, or trying to overcome, accept, or get through some of these 12 sticking points. So let's walk us through that 5-step process. And then afterward, we can talk about some of those generational ghost stories, and we'll unpack that a little bit more after.
So the first thing we do when we come across, a different generation, and we want to avoid the ignoring, the fixing, the cutting a deal, and we want to move into leading, is we just kind of identify and acknowledge, oh, I think this may be generational. I think this may be related to life stage. I don't understand why all these younger employees don't stick around anymore. Well, because your life stage is much more settled. Anybody ever tried to move with a junior hire? You're what? We're what? Yeah, we got this great opportunity, and your mom may not ever come again. And so we're going to have to move to, here they are, second week of dating when they're, middle school, junior high, and they're in their 30s. Your kid's in their 30s, and they're like, I found the best love of my life. And, the best, I gave him the best 2 weeks of my life, junior high love. And they are still bitter about that move all those years later. So we're much less willing in our later life stages. And we're like, I don't know what's wrong. Why aren't they loyal? Because people in their 20s and the emerging adulthood life stage have much more flexibility. If we just acknowledge, I think this might be generational, then we can begin to go lead through it as opposed to fuss about it.
And that's what you say is that first step, is acknowledge. Talk about the generational differences. Competitive advantages goes to the team that can bring those differences and frustrations out in the open where they can be resolved.
You can simply turn generational sticking points into the kind of conversations that stick you together. It was a double meaning in the title. So sometimes we wonder if we were too clever in that title to have kind of that double meaning. But the goal is you turn generational sticking points into conversations using these 5 steps that allow you then to have actually tie the team together tighter than they could have been if you didn't have those generational differences. The second is we then start to appreciate, and you already alluded to that, Charles, where if we can begin to appreciate those differences, we can lead through them. Like Colin Powell said, leaders love their soldiers. They wake up in the morning, they love their soldiers. They go to bed at night and love their soldiers. And the only way to do that is to appreciate those differences. Even if after I visit your generational country for a while, I come back and say, I like where I'm from. Nice place to visit. I wouldn't want to live there. But when I'm there with you, I'm not going to be a jerk about it. So we just appreciate what there is to appreciate in those differences. And we also appreciate the common needs. Even though our generations are different, our life stage is different, our needs are common. Third thing is that we flex. Once we appreciate, flexing happens almost instinctively. Until we appreciate, we can't flex. Hey, we're going to do it this way and this way. I don't know why we have to make it so complicated. But as soon as you appreciate the differences, you're like, oh, okay. Yeah, if you want to take notes on your phone, take notes on your phone. Please, no gaming, but feel free to take notes on your phone. We can begin to flex where it was a pretty rigid rule. And then fourthly, we can begin to leverage the differences. I'm talking to the Navy, and they did a big study and discovered that while Gen Zers are on social media all the time, they don't use social media for work. And it's not a great place to put messages that the Navy wants to get across. I think many organizations have learned that. You can advertise in social media, but social media is not the place where people go to get their work messages. There's a pretty big divide in the functions within their life. Learning how to leverage those tools, how to leverage the way a particular generation or group thinks, simply makes us more effective at coming up with broader, better solutions. You cannot connect with customers of a different generation if you can't connect with employees of a different generation. Employees are the batting cages that allow us to actually get in the game with customers. So if you're struggling with a generation of employees, you are definitely struggling with the generation of customers. And that usually takes care of half of them, Charles. Those first four take care of half the sticking points. Now, the other half require calling it, require resolving it, require kind of putting stake in the ground, making a decision. It's a provisional decision. We resolve it provisionally. Hey, for the next year or two, let's do it this way, and then we'll look at it again. I always joke, nobody wants to have meetings, 4 different ways. All right, next week will be boomer meetings. The week after that, we'll do a Gen Xer oriented meeting. And then one of the least happy plants I had ever worked at, it was done in Texas. So they had Latin music one day, they had rock one day, they had country one day, and they had silence the fourth day. That way everybody could get what they want 25% of the time. And so sometimes we overdo it trying to make everybody happy. That's too much flexing, not enough just calling it, not enough resolving it. And so have them need a resolution, even if it's just provisional. So in summary, we acknowledge it. Most important one, we appreciate the differences. That leads us right into flexing. And we go beyond just solving it to actually turn it into goodness by leveraging it. And that does the trick half the time. And the other half the time, we need to make a provisional resolution. So we resolve it.
I love that process. And getting back to the flexing, because all policies can't be flexible. So you need to decide where and when to flex. And I love how you identify that to some extent, that when it comes to generational sticking points, the hardest thing for many people is separating their preferences from the needs of the organization. So perhaps you can unpack the difference between a generational preference and a business necessity.
I like to use the classic flip-flop. So the person will be able to wear sandals or flip-flops. Should you have open-toed kind of shoes? And it's funny how many organizations are still pretty set on that. And the way I like to say it is, are you going to lose a foot? Is it a safety thing? You're going to lose money, you're going to lose a customer, or if you're a nonprofit government agency, you're going to lose funding. You're not going to lose one of those 4 things. It's not a necessity. It's your preference. And I've had people argue like, no. Dressing professionally is a business necessity. Yes, but what determines professional dress? Well, it's obvious. It is until, you show up in the grocery business and now you're heavily overdressed for the people you're calling on, or you show up in often in technology, or now in after COVID, a whole lot of spots are much more informal. Even I, a 60-year-old, am wearing a blazer with blue jeans when I do speeches, even with large groups, now about half the time. What happened to the world where blue jeans are now, professional dress? It's just, there's no simple answer to those things when there used to be.
And I love how you distinguish between the different generations there, and it hopefully will help other generations to understand them better. And for each of the five generations, and I probably would only focus on, maybe we can focus on just three or four of them right now, just giving some insights into what really distinguishes this generation from all the other ones. And it's these shared experiences within the generation. So, baby boomers, you have different ones in there. The baby boomers came after the traditionalists. It's still one of the largest generations, but is there a signature event that really kind of unifies this generation and helps others to understand it better?
Probably the signature event is the size, or as you already mentioned, or the boom of the generations, and combine that with the move from farm to city. So the traditionalists grew up with a far greater number of people related to farming or rural life, small towns. And after World War II, there was a flip flop. And now almost 70% of the United States and to some degree Canada, we're now in larger urban areas as opposed to more rural areas. Well, one of the things that's different is urban areas, people have smaller families. And it happens all over the world that as things urbanize, people have smaller families. And that puts more attention on the children that are there. If you got six kids, if Haydn doesn't turn out that great, whatever. You only got so many resources to invest. Whereas, when you've got two kids, fairness matters a lot more. The resources, your hopes and expectations. And so the researcher, the gentleman that coined the phrase baby boomer, his book about the baby boomers was called Great Expectations. And so I think that's one of the things that shaped the baby boomers is that move to smaller families and great expectations. And the fact that there were so many of them that they dominated everything in their path.
One thing I love how what came up from reading the book too was that this generation is really workaholics because there were so many of them. They had to compete with everything. Overcrowded hospitals, grade schools, sports teams, campuses, job markets told them to compete hard for whatever you want. They didn't get participation trophies. They weren't entitled. It was you work hard and hopefully, if you're good enough, you will get what you want. But there was nothing that was given to them, and they certainly didn't have that entitlement mentality that maybe is indicative of more of the younger generations.
Well, there was certainly not the conversation around fairness. If you look at the counterculture, there was a huge focus on what's fair, what's equitable, what's right, and a questioning of why things weren't fair for some groups or for some people. So that, I could have some baby boomers going, have you never, ever heard of Woodstock? Okay, get it. But in terms of what you just described, Charles, people show up at work and they're like, yeah, there are 15 of us that are jumping for the same promotion. And it's only going to go to one of us. And so there's no crying in baseball. So, whatever. Whereas it's much more focused on what's fair, et cetera. Human resources has a much larger role in making sure promotions are handled fairly. Whereas when baby boomers were being promoted, there was still often an arm going around a shoulder. Sorry, I'm on camera, hard to demonstrate that. An arm going around a shoulder, somebody saying you need to wear a tie because we've been talking and we think you're going to be a good supervisor. And so if there was a process, it still was bypassed most of the time. Whereas today, that would be a lawsuit. And in most organizations, it just wouldn't be allowed. So there is a much bigger emphasis today on fairness than there was in the workplace then, Charles, because you're right. There were just so many more people who were available for the jobs than there were. Now, contrast that with Gen X. And Gen X is substantially smaller. So they went from a baby boom to what sometimes Gen X is called the echo bust. So instead of an echo boom, there was an echo bust. And the baby busters, as they were often called, they didn't have to compete for jobs. Their boomer boss says to them, hey, we need you in Tulsa, like that Friends episode. And the only reason Chandler, being an Xer, had to go to Tulsa is because he fell asleep in the meeting and said yes to what he didn't know. And so, whereas boomers never had a chance to ask. Boomers were like, you get asked 3 times, and after that, you'll never be asked again. So you better say yes the first time out. And you don't call home and ask your partner, if you want to move, you just say, hey, baby, I got a promotion and we're relocating. Whereas with Gen X, that never would have worked because there were so few of them comparatively. There wasn't nearly the competition. And that's one of the big characteristics of Gen X is they had more power in certain respects because they were smaller, because there were fewer of them. And a higher percentage of them went into management because there just weren't as many of them.
Well, that's good news for me because I'm part of that generation. But other characteristics that I noted from that was, divorce is prevalent. They were the latchkey kids, multiple recessions. They didn't grow up in the same environment as the boomers. It was a global competition came on, children's faces on milk cartons. So Gen Xers really had to roll with the bad news and land on their feet. I love the analogy that you say that their lives kind of matched the video game Donkey Kong because of all the obstacles they had to overcome, mitigate, jump over, or just go through. And their guiding mantra during this is get real. And that was a phrase heard quite a bit because they've been kind of the squished generation as well.
Well, they are squished because they're small between the massive generation of boomers and the massive generation of millennials. And what's interesting, I know I'm geeking out just a little bit here, Charles. But there's the first half of generation and then the second half of generation. So first wave, second wave, whatever you want to call it. What's interesting is the second half of the traditionalists. They had Gen X. And the first half of the Gen Xers, they had millennials. Second half of Gen Xers, they had Gen Z. Well, ironically, the second half of Gen X, they were small, but they had the larger part of the millennials. The baby boomers didn't have the largest section of millennials. It was the Xers, the smallest generation, that did. And so what's fascinating about that is even though the Xers were small and they got into the family business later, they had kids later in life than previous generations, they ended up having either none, the research shows, or a whole lot of them. And as a result, they brought about a really large generation. So many people find it fascinating that it's not boomers had millennials, Xers have Gen Z. It's actually split. The generations are split in half by whether it was the first half or the second half that did it. So it's a little more complicated than it often gets expressed in the average book or the average speech you hear.
That is fascinating because you think that one generation is going to give birth to the next one, and it's not as clear cut. They aren't those clear defining or dividing lines. Let's move into millennials. Millennials, they were the wanted generation. Heavy parental environment or involvement, which I'm a little bit jealous of because the Xers were kind of the ones that were left to figure it out on their own. But when the millennials came along, they were wanted. Parents really wanted them. They wanted to stay involved in their lives. They wanted to help them in whatever way they could in succeeding in college, school, whatever the case may be. And that shows up.
Charles, I can hear the sound of helicopter blades circling over all that they did.
Right. So give us some characteristics or maybe a defining story for this generation that's going to be, if not the biggest, it's second biggest in the workforce right now.
Oh, you bet. And the fact that they had a lot of focus and attention gave them quite a bit of confidence. So one of the things that surprised them is Xers were fairly mellow. There were so many traditionalists, so many boomers, and Xers were different in a lot of ways. They kind of showed up in tie-dye, wanted to bring their pet to work, and they could when the market was looking for people and when things were hot, and then they go through another recession and suddenly it was, leave your dog at home and put on a tie. And so the Xers had that back and forth, but the millennials, they came in confident. They were coached to be confident. And they were coached to ask for what they want. And think about it. The traditionalists had a small percentage of people who were used to working in management ranks, whereas baby boomers had a much higher percentage. The older Xers, a much higher percentage of parents that had corporate experience, professional experience, management experience. And so they're coaching their millennial kids to ask different questions in interviews. All right, well, what's the match on the 401k and has that ever changed? Well, companies weren't used to that. Hey, my parents had a couple of questions they also wanted answered. And, I had the head of HR for a pharmaceutical company. I will not name say we have an entire file drawer. This is 15 years ago, file drawer of letters from parents that we keep for legal purposes. And they all like shook their head. But, today people even say, are there any other things that you want to know or other people that you've asked for advice might want to know about the assumption is that there's a whole team of people around that person. And I'd say that's what one of the key shaping aspects of millennials is they had a team. They had pediatricians, batting coaches, soccer coaches, algebra coaches. And so when there was a struggle, you just brought somebody in. And it about killed me to pay a person to help my children pick a school and get into college. It about killed me to peel off $1,500 to pay them to do it. I'm like, just down the road, one of our friends is a guidance counselor. He'll walk us through it. And my wife goes, that kid is not going to listen to us. Sure enough, by getting better scores and, better scholarships, we saved like 15,000 per child by building a team. It was crazy. It was hard for me in my generation to wrap my head around hiring people to coach my kids. And, it doesn't help when Mrs. Shaw says, see, I told you, should have just listened to me the first time.
Well, and just playing off of what you said too, and just reiterating it is they were raised to believe that they could do something great. They were encouraged to express their feelings, and they were raised, really not keeping score in organized leagues or sports events for the fear that losing would make them feel bad. So everyone got kind of a participation trophy. And this is kind of where you get that entitlement mentality based on how they were raised and that confidence that they deserve something better. And I think that can be misaligned with them or misinterpreted with someone saying that, well, they don't have the work ethic. Well, that could be the case, but it's not necessarily the case. It's just the way they were raised and their mentality. They're still willing to work hard, and they represent such a large part of the workforce right now that you can't ignore them. You shouldn't fix them. Really, you need to know how to lead them more effectively.
Millennials work really hard. Some don't, but the vast majority of them work really hard because they've hit the stage in life where they need to pay rent or make a mortgage. And emerging adulthood is the life stage that is the culprit or at the root of the explanation for some of the things that previous generations have not liked about millennials. Every generation has some characteristics I prefer and some characteristics I don't, as well as my own. I'm a cusper of both the Xers and the boomers. So I have characteristics of both right there, being right in the middle of that time frame. So both those generations have things I like, things I don't. The same applies with me and millennials.
If you could expand upon the point where the transition to adulthood is happening later and later, and many people, I still think that's unknown to many people, that they feel the traditionalists, they grew up faster. They became adults sooner. Each generation is becoming adults later, at a later age for various reasons.
Yeah, you bet. Now, my daughter, 28, she would get very upset if I were to imply that she was not a fully functioning adult with, her own medical career, her own ability to handle her bills and make her life decisions, etc. On the other hand, she'd be the first to say, well, no, I'm not an adult. I'm adulting. And so, that whole phrase adulting is what's developed in popular language to capture this idea of a new life stage emerging adulthood. And so, there may be some things about the different generations that we prefer or we don't prefer. But the biggest explanations for a lot of things that older generations were like, they're entitled, they're snowflakes, they don't work hard. Some of the other criticisms, and the millennials sure receive their share of criticism. Gen Z doesn't get nearly as much hate mail as the millennials had received throughout their, and it's because they were just so big. Anyway, emerging adulthood is a better explanation. And Charles, you're right. When I ask groups, I have 500 people in a session, and I'll say, how many of you have heard of emerging adulthood? And, maybe 1%, 2% of hands go up because it's a new life stage. And the last time there was a life stage was 1890 when adolescence was coined. And so there's a new life stage now that people live longer and education takes longer between adolescence and now early adulthood. between 18 and 27, shows up all over the world. And, it's characterized by change, choice, and a lot of freedom. And it's extended. The average age of marriage was 22 for males, for the baby boomers. And now in most urban areas, in many places in the world, it's upper 20s. Here in the United States, it's 30 right now for males, is the average age of marriage for males. And matter of fact, Gen Zers will say that they don't plan to marry until they're about 30 because they need to establish their career and begin paying back their student loans. And so now that all those markers or characteristics of early adulthood have been pushed back, organizations are not dealing as much with, gosh, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with my Gen Zers. But actually, what you're talking about are people in their 20s, and your 20 somethings, you're emerging adults. You're actually talking about emerging adulthood leads to different kinds of behaviors or choices, different motivations than they did when it was much shorter. And I had 4 years between 18 and 22. I went to college. That was the length of my emerging adulthood. And now it's often longer.
Well, thank you for providing that explanation, because I think emerging adulthood can explain some of those generational differences. And if people are more aware of those, they might do things differently as a result, or at least have a greater understanding, a more holistic understanding of those transition times. And it may not be generational issues, it may be just life stage issues that they're dealing with instead. Let's talk about Gen Z, because they are likely going to represent the largest generation coming up. They have the mantra, which both my kids are Gen Z, or two of my three kids rather are Gen Z. You do you. So if you could just kind of unpack that, and maybe one of those generational stories that really binds this generation together.
And that's a great way to say it. You do you. Millennials were more group oriented. Gen Z is more about your own identity. And so, in some ways, people would say, well, what's the research show about millennials? And often, what the research shows about Gen Z is, I want my organization to create a personalized experience for me. Before we jumped on the phone, I was talking with an engineering company about a session we're going to do. And one of the things they said was, we need to help our people do feedback. Can we have a discussion around feedback? Yeah, sure. They said, "And how the different generations appreciate feedback." I said, you bet. The generations, the personality styles, the time you've been with the organization, all of those play in to what you want done with feedback. And you can see why managers can sometimes feel a bit overwhelmed by it. So I've got to dial in a team of 12, and they might want things done differently in each of those. And I would say, yeah, if you've ever had three children, Charles, you dial things in a little differently for each one of them because they don't respond the same way. It's just good human interaction and be able to read the room, being able to read between the lines with people.
Well, and both with millennials and Gen Z, they grew up in the digital age. Millennials grew up with the promise of social media and smartphones, while Gen Z grew up with the downsides, right? The unlimited information, the constant connection of social media that now has been replaced with fake news, online bullying, heightened depression. So, they didn't really experience a great recession necessarily, but they are going to be probably the most educated generation because their parents have taught them that additional education or getting a good education is critical to finding success as well.
Well, it's true. And even people who are not who don't go on a college track still see that you get behind very quickly if in whatever service or hands-on job you might have. You get behind very quickly if you don't stay up on things. And so there's that expectation of doing that. And you had mentioned greater anxiety and depression. Some of that comes from just the awareness on social media of what everybody else is doing, what everybody else has. And some of that came out of the isolation of COVID. But one of the things that's really different is Gen Z is much more willing to talk about their emotional and mental illnesses. And organizations, they're used to disability conversations around disability and accommodation. But I've had 3 conversations just this week with organizations saying, we're not sure what to do when someone says, yeah, I have anxiety and I'm going to need a moment. But you want everybody in the meeting to wait until what does that mean? What does accommodating mean now that people are much more open with what previous generations would have either hidden or medicated on, hidden that as well, but certainly not expressed it openly. Well, yeah, I'm somewhere on the autism spectrum, and so I don't handle these situations well. To self-identify and be quite open with that certainly makes it easier to manage. It's been suggested that 25% of people of males in engineering or IT are somewhere on the spectrum. Microsoft has even openly advertised to hire people along the autism spectrum. So we're much more open about it, which really helps people manage it differently. But boy, that's a new experience for a whole lot of team members and a whole lot of supervisors and managers. Just add some complexity to it. The fact that Gen Z is so much more open about mental and emotional health.
Well, and awareness of these generational differences is powerful, and it's going to change then team dynamics, hopefully break down some stereotypes. But you also have to remember that they're inevitable, these sticking points. They don't have to leave us stuck. And there's a process for getting through these sticking points and for us to stick closer together if you follow certain guidelines. So I'd like to go through a couple of those sticking points in the remaining time that we have. And the first one is about communication. And if you could kind of unpack that sticking point and give us some insights or some tips in how to bridge some of those communication divides between generations.
Let's just use the 5-step process and kind of work our way through, just like I did in the book. So first we acknowledge it. Hey, I wonder if this isn't what's wrong with them in the way they communicate. Hey, I wonder if this is a generational difference. So, I'm sitting in church and a guy kicks my chair about 17 times throughout the church service, which I thought was both rude and, since we're in church, wrong. The little punk afterwards said to me, "Hey, I got a question for you." And he'd brought his son into his construction business. And he's like, yeah, he'll send a text. And then one of the crews won't show up and we'll be behind. And I'll say, did you call them? Did you talk to them? Did they promise they were going to be here? No, but I texted them. And they texted back and said they were going to be here. He goes, yeah. Texts don't count as the same level of promise. He goes, what are you talking about? Well, and the dad said, I think this is generational. Yes, it's definitely generational. So what do we do about it? The first thing is we just acknowledge it and we appreciate it. Why? He goes, I don't understand why he wants to text instead of phone. Okay. Why does he want to text instead of phone? Can you get curious about that? And then that allows us to at least flex. Well, when is texting okay and when does it not work? Because right now we're behind schedule on 3 projects, 3 in this case houses, because people didn't show because I would have got a verbal commitment from them and it's more likely they would have been there and you got a text from them and they weren't. So I don't know with these people and this generation that it's delivering as well. And so we appreciate. And then we begin to flex and we look at some outside details with that. Well, let me take a different tack, different situation. Many times organizations are like, we're having trouble attracting some younger employees. And younger employees are like, well, can I use a Mac? The answer is no. This is what you get here. Here is the equipment package that you get. Well, a lot of organizations have had to adjust to that because 70% of people told Gartner part of what makes their decision and where they go for a job is how much flexibility they have in the technology, the hardware they get to select. And, but some of our programs don't run on a Mac. Got it. So what are the explanations and how well can you sell that and explain it? And there'll still be some people that are like, no, I want to have greater freedom. And it's related to that with work from home. Ironically, the younger the generation, the more important they see coming into physical space. It took the baby boomers 6 months. And after the baby boomers had 6 months of working from home and finally figured out the technology, baby boomers were like, I'm never wearing pants again. But Gen Z is, how am I going to build a network, build a career? How's this going to work if I don't, if I don't get this to happen? And so the irony is we can often stereotype when it comes to the whole question of remote work. We can often stereotype what generations will like it and what generations won't. The point is all generations, and the younger they are, the more they want flexibility. They want to come in, but they also want flexibility about where, and you ready? when they work. That's the one that often bothers organizations. Well, yeah, we need you to come in, or it's okay to work from home, but can I work at 11 and start at 10? Yeah, 11 at night. Can I start at 10 in the morning because I really like to get my run in and take care of some other things, and then I get another burst of energy after I've had dinner? Can I work at 11? So for many organizations, that's even more problematic than where you want to work. And so those kind of communication questions, do I get the technology I want? And do I get to communicate when and where I do my best stuff? And so, yeah, people who all through university were getting their work done at 1 a.m, who now come into work and they're like, really? You expect my brain to be popping at 8:15? Which tends to work for us older people when melatonin production shifts, right? Tends to work a little better, not as much for them. And so they're asking those kinds of communication questions and asking us if we can be more flexible. And a lot of organizations are struggling to figure out what their answer is going to be with that. And as a result, they didn't even get the chance to leverage step number 4, the strengths of the generation.
And that's important. You're right. And just a clarifying point that I wanted to emphasize is that no one should ever debate with the customers. It's the business necessity to flex your communication preferences to match theirs. So if your customers are traditionalists, you better pick up the phone and meet with them instead of using maybe email or social media. So you can flex depending on whether it's a business necessity or a generational preference, and have that as kind of the underlying reason as to why or why not you're flexing. But note that always the customer needs come first. And if you know your customers and know what generation they are, it's probably just good business to go with that preference for them.
It's a business necessity because you're going to lose money if you don't communicate the way your customer wants to communicate. Yeah, you said it really well.
Yeah, it's try to figure out that language that the other generations have and try to speak it. Organizations need to be asking generations to help them shape their messages so that they can better communicate with that generation's language. And it starts with that 5-step approach, which I think is great. Wanted to move to another sticking point, this time around
Hey,
feedback.
Charles, I'm going to tie back to one before we move on, tie back to one thing real quickly. And this is why you're not going to be good with customers unless you can be good with employees of that generation, just to your point about helping them shape the message. Your message isn't going to land right if you don't have somebody of that generation saying, yeah, that's not how we would say it. That's not the format we would use. That's not where we would put it. And how many organizations have got themselves into trouble because the message not only didn't land right, but was actually offensive to people. And they didn't realize why it was until later on when people broke it down for them. And if they just would have had some people to vet that through with, it would have made a big difference.
Well, that's an excellent point that you make, that the better you are with dealing with employees from different generations, that's definitely going to translate into the bottom line and dealing with customers from different generations better as well. So moving on to feedback, feedback is kind of a unique sticking point because I think all the generations would say they want more feedback. It's not one generation wants less. So it starts out with that common need that everyone, regardless of generation, wants to know how they're doing in their job and how they can improve, but it's different for each generation. So unpack that for us using that 5-step model to give us some insights around feedback and how it needs to be different for different generations.
Before we jump into that 5-step process, I would add to what you just said there as you kind of kick things off on the feedback topic, that I'm hearing more and more, especially because I've developed a process for dealing with retention. And one of the skill sets to have in that is to have effective one-on-ones. And one of the things that people say is, yeah, but some of my long-term employees, often older and long-term go together, not always, but often, they're saying, I don't need a every other week or every month one-on-one. I don't have anything new to tell you. Whereas many of the younger employees are like, yeah, I would like to do this like every 3 weeks, every 2 weeks. And so this has to do, I think, with longevity as much as it has to do with generations. That makes sense. So it's more of a life stage thing, life stage in the organization thing. But just to clarify what you were saying, it's not so much generational as it is how much information, what's new with that leader, with that manager, with feedback or one-on-ones, for example. Everybody wants it, and everybody wants positive feedback. And so that's really, I think, where managers get stuck. There's so much that needs to get done, and they need to communicate when something's not working, that they get behind on communicating that went really well. Charles, what you and I don't want are hey, you're great. Okay, well, let's see what happens when it's performance appraisal time and it's time for a raise. Let's see what great means. But specifically, hey, Charles, I really think you're a good interviewer. A whole lot of interviewers skim through the book or only read the press sheet. You actually read the whole thing. You make interviewing really easy. You do this well. And here are some things that you do well. That kind of conversation, a person can do something with, a person feels like is real and is valid. And if we don't make time for positive feedback, what we end up with is the, hey, you're great. Thank you so much for your contribution. And a number of other vague things. I love the New Yorker cartoon that says, keep up the good work, whatever it is, whoever you are, as a manager walks through a room of people, right? You end up with that stuff. And so the 5-step process helps us with both positive and negative feedback. We acknowledge feedback may be generational in the way it's received. Secondly, how do we appreciate the differences? Baby boomers wanted to hear positive things because they believed that meant they were going to get a promotion. Matter of fact, baby boomers would go off to a training program and frame the certificate. I still remember when Gen X made the dominant proportion of training classes because most of the certificates were left in the back of the room. I'd spend 20 minutes signing them all, and 3 people would take them. Baby boomers would take them all and go hang them up, frame them and hang them up by Tuesday. Whereas Gen X is like, do I have to take it? Why are you killing trees? And so just a whole different experience of collecting the feedback to prove that I should get this. So part of the reason Xers were frustrated with the amount of feedback they received is, the Xer would say, so you and I, Charles, as Xers, we'd say, hey, how's this project going? And a lot of bosses would go, I don't know, let me check with HR if I can tell you it's not time for our quarterly review. And it was so formal because they were working to make sure that people didn't feel disappointed or there was an advantage. And since it was so competitive, and Xers were like, can't 2 human beings have a conversation? Well, no, not as competitive as things were. And then that began to shift. And now with millennials would ask for feedback. I would say the most frequent complaint of all 4 of my millennial children has been, I can't get negative feedback at work. Now, to be fair, it only takes a couple of times for a manager to give negative feedback and see their employee crumple before they're like, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to do it quite the same way. But for managers, I just want you to know, I hear maybe more than any single thing that it is very difficult to get a corrective or negative feedback from their boss when they ask. And so most of us could be better at what we do if we were better at bringing that. And then Gen Z, it is much more important to be supportive in the negative feedback. So how do I win? And who's on my team? Who's got my back? Would be key characteristics that you've got to be able to answer if you're going to retain Gen Z. For Gen Zers, study after study. Coaching is the equivalent of management. I like to say it this way. Coaching equals management. Mic drop. Everything else you do as a manager to Gen Z, that's okay. But coaching is management. So if you don't coach, you're not a manager no matter what else you do. And so it is intensified, you can see, as you go through the generation.
Well, thank you for providing that insight. As we're wrapping up this episode, perhaps we can just touch upon one more, and that's around loyalty, that sticking point, and just give us some insight into that quickly in regards to how that's viewed by different generations and maybe some tips.
You bet. So loyalty is as much emerging adulthood as it is, because you think of it, the characteristics are freedom, choice, and change. That means that emerging adults are often, even if they love the job, are often looking. Or as one manager said, I really, really like this employee. And then they went on Match.com and found love in Seattle. You can't blame them for falling in love, but it really messes up my succession plan because I had high hopes for them. And so that's just part of emerging adulthood, as opposed to when early adulthood happened earlier for previous generations. And then secondly, baby boomers settled down at an earlier age. I graduated from college on Saturday, got married the next Saturday. Xers, a little more emerging adulthood and a lot less stable workforce. So the expectation that you would stay in a job your whole career had disappeared by the time Gen X came along. Millennials, you bet. The loyalty, I'm loyal, but I'm also looking. So surveys showed the millennials were the happiest employees when they were younger in their career and also looking for a job, which threw organizations off. If I keep you happy, Gen X, then you'll stay. And Xers were like, yeah. Millennials, if I keep you happy, you'll stay. Not necessarily. And with Gen Z looks at it and says, I need a lot of variety of experiences for me to be well-rounded, not just within the same organization, but often in different industries or different organizations. And so it's nothing personal if I leave. And so that's a different way of looking at the world. And then one very practical insight around that, Charles, one of the big differences in emerging adulthood is to ask questions and then shut up. Now, I know good coaching does that, but it's especially important for people 18 through 28 because the research shows that if they have authority figures that, other than their parents, that allow them to think out loud, they value and respect those relationships, have high trust in those relationships. And ironically, if they'll think out loud about leaving, they'll be more likely to stay. The best thing you can do to help emerging adults stay is to give them the chance to think out loud about leaving and just, at one point or two say, I wondered about that too. I had to sort through those questions. Those are legitimate questions, whether you want to stay in this industry. I don't know. I don't like those things about this kind of job either. So what are you thinking? And instead of going, I got to figure out how to talk them into staying, we just cool down our listening, cool down our brain. Instead of getting hot, we just cool it down and lean into their negatives, lean into their questions and let them think it out loud. It's a big factor in loyalty.
Wonderful. Thank you for providing those insights on that sticking point, which is what you and I were talking about prior to the interview, has become probably the most in-demand sticking point on how to overcome that. Before we end the interview, I always like to ask, what's one key takeaway or insight you would like listeners to gain from your work on sticking points and leading different generations in the workplace?
Charles, you already gave it. So I'll just have to quote you. And that is, if we ask why rather than what, we get curious, and curious makes us appreciate. And if we appreciate, then we can begin to flex. And if we flex, we can then take it a step further and leverage. And when we leverage the different generations, we actually end up sticking together better than we would have if we wouldn't have had the conversations that those generational differences created. So generational sticking points can be the best fuel for creating teams that stick together.
A great action item. Thank you so much for joining me, Haydn, today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
You bet. People-driven results and Haydn, Haydn. I know it's the Australian version. Haydn.Shaw at peopledrivenresults.com.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?